I thought by way of introduction I would mention that it's probably not surprising to you that America's oldest university began acquiring American art before America was a nation, and that centuries later it has an absolutely superb collection of American art. Nor should it be a surprise to you as a result that Harvard's collections in all its areas cumulatively rank it as the finest college or university collection in our country, and I think you could extend it beyond our country. And I think our friends at Oxford and Cambridge would reluctantly agree. But what might be surprising to you is that the American Art Department at Harvard was founded in 2002. They take the long view. So for a university founded in the 17th century, it only took, let's see, the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, the 20th, the 21st century to create an American Art Department at the Harvard University Art Museum. But it was worth the wait because the founding curator of that department, Ted Stebbins, is our speaker tonight and is at the absolute apex of the field today. Educated at Yale and Harvard, and previously curator of American art at the MFA Boston, Ted Stebbins is now just about midway through a 4-volume catalog of Harvard's American art collections. You see, Harvard had to wait long enough so that it merited a 4-volume study. Ted has published extensively on many, many American subjects. He has an acknowledged expertise on the work of Martin Johnson Heade as well as many other artists. As you can see behind me, the topic for this evening, Changing Tastes, Changing Times, Collecting American Art, from Charles Willson Peale to Alice Walton. So that is quite a range. After the lecture, we'll have time for about 3 questions, and then everyone is invited to join us for libations and conversation in the Robinson Atrium of the Stent Wing right next door. So please give a very warm welcome to our friend Ted Stebbins.
Thank you. Thanks very, very much. It's great to see you. I've had people come at times a distance to hear me lecture, but I've never had a family travel from Australia. So I'm very glad to welcome all of you, including the distant travelers. The title of the talk you saw on the screen, the earlier title was A Taste for American Art, Heroes, Villains, and the Art Market Today. My wife instructed me not to use that title because she said there are no villains. And so I didn't want to get into a theological discussion, so I changed the title to the one you see here. Susan and I both had the most extraordinary 2 days in Atlanta. The hospitality of you all, the gracefulness of 3 different families who welcomed us to see their really extraordinary collections, the great hospitality of Michael Shapiro, the director, the extraordinary patience and kindness of Stephanie Height, the curator of American art, then seeing the rebuilt, renewed, reinstalled, and reinvigorated High Museum is alone worth several trips. So it's really wonderful. I congratulate all of you on what you've been doing. And I have in this talk a few little notes to collectors about things to do, but you don't need them. Atlanta does not need any advice. Whatever you're doing really really brilliant. So thanks very, very much for coming. Tonight, I'd like to lead you through about 200 years of taste and collecting American art, changing taste. We'll do this survey through the eyes of 7 major collectors and tastemakers, from Charles Willson Peale at the end of the 18th century to Alice Walton today. If you need to leave early, or you may snooze during part of this talk, all you need to remember from it, if someone asks you what it was about, is that taste changes. Styles and painters come into fashion, then go out, then in many cases, but not all, return. We all know this intuitively, it's obvious, but it's a relatively new concept. Philosophers from Plato to Kant view taste and quality and art as fixed. John Keats, in his Ode to Aggression Erin, wrote that beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. Beautiful poetry, not unfortunately seemingly true in our day. Edmund Burke wrote that the whole groundwork of taste is common to all. But in recent years, we have come to realize that truth is more elusive than this, and that beauty more relative. We were all enough students of history to know this. I always loved teaching and discussing chairs as well as silver teapots. They're essentially abstract objects. The purpose is simple, to seat a human body, but the way they change, the way the chair, say, changes over 5,000 years, doesn't reflect any more or less utility. No better chair is actually made. It's simply a matter of style, the way each period sees its own time. We're always, in our own time, wedded to our own view. We're part of the prevailing zeitgeist, or what Jung called the collective unconscious. Why else did it seem so important to everyone in 1890 that women have small waists, or to men in the 1950s that their cars have huge fins? Like it or not, we're all conformists. Turning briefly to American art. This is the pointer, I think. Oh, good. Turning briefly to American art. Art in the form of portraits, fine furniture, and ceremonial silver was made in Boston and the rest of the colonies as early as the 1660s, but it was not until near the end of the 18th century that the art world, as we know it, began to take shape. The key figure in this development, of course, was Charles Willson Peale, who founded the nation's first museum in 1786. You see him here on the left welcoming us to his museum. He was a great American genius, a scientist, naturalist, inventor, archaeologist, patriot, friend and painter of Washington, and above all, a lover of the fine arts. Here he stands as an old man welcoming us to his building. On the left, you see all the bird and animal specimens, and above them, right there and here, rows of his own portraits of the founders of the nation. To the right, you find the legs of the first American mastodon, and some of the bones are out here. This is not a specialized art museum, but rather a early Smithsonian, a general museum of human knowledge, where material history, geology, ornithology, and the fine arts all had their places. Interestingly, on the right, you see Titian Peale's, his son's, watercolor of the same room at an earlier date. And already you see in the museum profession that this installation, the early installation with the casts and cases, has been replaced when the mastodon was discovered. They went, and the curators moved in the big beast into the room. Peale painted portraits and all sorts of other kinds of art. He organized the first exhibition of American art and the first art school. And taking no chances, he named his children Titian, Rembrandt, Raphael, Rubens, Sophonisba, Angelica, and so on, all after painters. Here they are digging up the mastodon on the left, and at the right you see a detail from that painting, the entire family carrying on the archaeological expedition, just as the entire family painted. Each son and daughter was given a specialty in the family. They were primarily portrait painters. For years I've been recommending to people that they collect portraits. No one has ever followed my advice on that until recently, when our friend Dan Pollock in New York began to collect beautiful portraits. These are three he owns, from the left, by Rembrandt, James, and Charles Wilson Peale. Three fabulous examples. All three we don't want to discuss money and things like that, but all three very reasonably priced and cost much less than other kinds of art today. So I think portraits are still a wonderful buy. Collecting American art in earnest began in the early 19th century, and with it came new personality types: the collector, the dealer, and the critic. People have been arguing ever since about the relative merits and the influence and power of each of these. 1834 saw the first published history of American art written by William Dunlap. And Dunlap, in his still very useful book, lists about a dozen active art collectors already in the 1830s, including Thomas Handyside Perkins in Boston, Philip Hone and Luman Reed in New York, Edward Carey in Philadelphia, and whom Stephanie knows something about, and Daniel Wadsworth in Hartford. However, the outstanding collector, I believe, was Robert Gilmore, whom you see here on the left. Robert Gilmore Jr. of Baltimore. His wealthy father sent him on a grand tour in the English manner, grand tour of the continent around 1800, and he collected a large cabinet of pictures, library, minerals, autographs, engravings, drawings, and various works of art attributed to Holbein, Raphael, Leonardo, and many others. He and his wife were painted in London by the most eminent London portraitist, Sir Thomas Lawrence. You see on the left the Lawrence of Robert Gilmore. Gilmore also commissioned from Gilbert Stuart one of Stuart's last portraits of Washington, which you see on the right. Like many American collectors from that time until this, Gilmore began with European art, but turned increasingly to American as the American painters simply became better in the second and third decades of the 19th century. Like many collectors to follow, he bought Stuart and the older masters, while at the same time becoming patrons of younger painters. From Gilmore's time, collectors in this country have had patriotism as one of their motivations. They put a premium on historic and patriotic works, on portraits of Washington or one of the signers, or on pieces of silver or furniture associated with the founders. It's a very interesting thing that's going on now. In the past, a portrait of a historic figure might bring 3 or 4 times as much on the market as the same quality portrait of an unknown figure. But now, the American interest in history and the patriotic past is increasing again and again, so that, to give you just one example, a fine miniature by John Ramage, an example you see on the right, is typically worth around $10,000. But in 2001, his life portrait of Washington, which once belonged to Martha Washington, brought $1,216,000 at auction. Thus, the historic work is valued at some 120 times the price of an ordinary work by the same artist. Obviously, our museums continue to be repositories both of art and history. which I don't argue with. I just think it's important for each institution and collector to be clear about its own policy and mission and to know exactly what it's paying for when it makes an acquisition. Gilmore wasn't afraid to take chances. He bought 3 still lifes, which is a very low-rated genre at the time, and one that still offers opportunity, I think, for collectors. He bought still lifes from James, Raphael, and Sarah Miriam Peale. You see a Sarah Miriam on the left, and he very early on recognized the ability of a leading young genre painter, William Sidney Mount, and bought 2 works, including the painting on the right, Bargaining for a Horse by Mount. More importantly, Gilmore was one of the discoverers of Thomas Cole, the most talented young painter of the day, and the virtual founder of the American Landscape School. Is the sound okay? Or am I too close to the microphone? What, too close? This is better? Somebody hoot from the back if you can't hear me. Gilmore funded Cole's first trip to Europe, but he constantly lectured Cole on the superiority of American views over European. He wrote, "I prefer real American scenes and compositions." I show you here 2 of the Coles that Gilmore owned, a Catskill view on the left and an American history scene, The Last of the Mohicans. Most collectors up to the present day have had the same preference. I understand that we Americans love our native scenery, but if I had the choice between a poor Cole of the Catskills and a wonderful one of Italy, or a well-painted allegorical view such as this Prometheus by Cole on the right, I would certainly take one of the latter. What I love, and I try to be a student of, is the irrationalities of the art market. The art market is a wonderfully irrational place, and I used to know much more about it. The more I go on, the less and less I think I actually know. Gilmore, like so many collectors, was public-spirited, and he hoped that his collection would go to a public institution, as he said, in order to diffuse a taste for works of art and cultivate the general taste. However, financial reverses made this impossible, and the collection was unfortunately sold and dispersed. This story is repeated again and again through the years. Money comes and money goes. For the museum director and the curator, the moral is clear. Promises are great, good intentions are fine, but you'd better get it now. With the critic and the collector came the dealer, both a necessity and some would say a necessary evil. Michael Paff, the most famous early dealer in New York in 1812, was described by a contemporary as the Prince of Pictures. The Prince of Pictures, statuary, medals, and knickknacks. He bought, sold, and jobbed pictures, and when required, repaired, varnished, and repainted them. Man of many talents. I used to know dealers like that who repaired their pictures themselves. Another dealer, Brett, was described by Gilmore in his diary as a quiet, smooth-tongued man. And he thought him to be a cunning dog who knows well how to take advantage of a collector. So the battle between the dealers and the collectors has been going on ever since. I'll show you here pictures of 4 well-known New York art dealers. The three smiling ones are not incarcerated, let me put it that way. At the same time, it's fair to say that we cannot characterize dealers any more than any other group. There continue to be many of the Paff type, some of whom you read about from time to time, and there are others, many others, who are honest and knowledgeable, who truly love art, who are pleasant to work with, and who have contributed very significantly and generously to the field. Michael Shapiro was asking me last night whom I studied with in terms of American art at Harvard. There wasn't anyone teaching American art when I was there. My real professor was a wonderful old dealer in Boston named Robert Vos, and I would go down there once or twice a week and I just learned from their turnover of paintings in his gallery and his friendly willingness to teach a neophyte something about it. Jumping to mid-century, I take as my exemplar William W. Corcoran, a highly successful broker and banker of Washington, D.C., who was able to retire at 56 to devote himself to art and philanthropy. In 1869, he gave his collection to the city along with a magnificent Second Empire building that you see at the upper right, designed by the prominent architect James Renwick. The Corcoran thus ranks with the Met and with Boston, both founded the year later, 1870, as one of the first great museums in the nation. Interestingly, as we were talking about taste, Corcoran soon found the Renwick building unfashionable and outdated, and before his death in 1888, he moved the collection to a new building built in the newly fashionable classical Beaux-Arts style that you see at the lower right, where it's still housed. And interestingly, it was worth spending a large amount of money for the collector to move out of a very beautiful, suitable building, but somehow gotten unfashionable. Both the Met and Boston did the same thing. They both were originally housed in Victorian, Ruskinian buildings, and within 20 or 30 years had moved to classical ones. Corcoran's taste was very much in line with Gilmore's. He still favored realistic landscapes of native scenery, though he concentrated not on Cole and the older generation, but rather on Cole's Hudson River School successors, including Frederick E. Church and Albert Bierstadt. Here you see his painting by Church, the famous Niagara, which many people think is one of the greatest of all American landscapes, and his Bierstadt of Mount Corcoran. Like Gilmore, Corcoran in the pre-Civil War years believed in an America as a perfectible place. He loved the work of painters who saw our land, as the early Hudson River School did, as a Garden of Eden, a place without sorrow or pity. And the image of Edenic America is very popular up until the war. I might add that the Corcoran Gallery was for years, even up to the time of my early career in the 1960s, one of the places to see American art, ranking with the Met and the Detroit Institute of Arts. Heavy competition, however, came from other Washington institutions, especially the National Gallery, which has had tremendous growth over the last 30 or 40 years, and the Smithsonian, which has also done very well. Both of those institutions grew and prospered, and both did so partly with the help of taxpayer money. The Corcoran kind of became the third or fourth museum in Washington, and now, for quite a few years, it seemed in quite a forlorn state. So this brings me back to the need for museums to do what the High has been doing for quite a long time, that the need for museums to have regular growth and change and to build if they are to remain competitive. Everything changes, including the way we rank and see the museums. Moving to around 1900, Thomas B. Clark and William T. Evans were the two greatest collectors at the end of the 19th century. To take Evans here as our prime example, you see the headline announcing his death, where it's clear that he was seen here the way he wanted to be seen, as an art collector, patron of young artists. He gave 160 paintings to the National Gallery in Washington. I won't get into it, but the National Gallery wasn't then the National Gallery. He really gave them to what's now a museum many of you know well, the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. But he created his reputation, a new reputation for himself, not as a businessman, but as a collector, as someone with superb taste. Collecting became a way in those years for someone to form a new identity. If you think of the rough personalities of some of the builders of some of our museums, let's not mention any names, but if you knew them in person, you might not like them, but when you think of them, now you think of the glorious collections that they left behind for the people of America, and that's just the way they intended it. Evans and his generation of collectors represent a dramatic change of taste, a truly dramatic one, from the glories of American scenery as painted by Church and Bierstadt to the pleasure of a quiet contemplation of nature, of foreign travel, and of idealized female form. They moved, in a nutshell, from the landscapes of Frederick E. Church to the sweetness of Frederick S. Church, no relative, who was Evans' favorite painter. He owned 21 works by him, including the two you see here, The Viking's Daughter and Girl with Rabbits. An entire change of taste. Evans loved landscape as much as Corcoran had, but the landscapes he admired were very different ones. Again, generalized, moody, introspective, often showing the diffused light of evening. Most of the painters favored by Evans and Clark and the other major collectors of this time, including William Morris Hunt, Henry Ward Ranger, J. Francis Murphy, H. Bolton Jones, Charles Dewey, and many others I could go on to list, all major figures in that day have all virtually disappeared from sight. These painters, sometimes called tonalists, they are a group that today is of almost no interest to collectors, dealers, scholars, or museums. The basement of many museums, such as Boston or the Met, is full of these works. The MFA, for instance, owns something like, the MFA in Boston owns something like 60 paintings by Hunt, whose work you see at the upper left here. And when I was curator there, the trustees would often ask, why don't you sell those? Why do you keep those bad paintings? I would answer in three ways. The great museum collections are meant to be truly encyclopedic. You just don't decide to cut out the letters E to M at random. Two, the paintings are not actually bad. They just look bad to us. They're out of fashion. And you don't believe me. I can tell. But Michael and Stephanie were going to start building a collection of these paintings now as a hedge against the future. These paintings may well return to favor, because that's what typically happens in American taste. They look bad to us, they looked good once, they may well look good again. The taste doesn't change, of course, arbitrarily. There are always reasons for it, and when we look out with our eyes, whether we're judging 19th century painting or contemporary painting, we're looking at with the same set of eyes. There's always a consistency between the art that we like in the past and the art we like in the present. In Evans' case, the turn toward the moody and the tonal, toward landscapes of the mind rather than celebrations of natural wonders, reflects a national turn inward toward reflection rather than exploration. The national frontier in the West was declared closed by the historian Frederick Jackson Turner in 1890. We had become an urban nation with towns, trains, and industry everywhere. The new ease of European travel, economic hard times, the women's movement, many factors played a role. If Bierstadt and Frederick E. Church parallel the writing, say, of Thoreau's Walden or of Melville's Moby Dick, then the new generation of tonalists reflect the complex, introverted writing style of someone like Henry James. Not all of Evans' collection was made up of now forgotten artists. As you see here, he owned many works by Alexander Wyant, top left, by Homer D. Martin, top right, who are at least known today, if not much admired. And he had both George Inness at the lower left, who is highly regarded now, and Winslow Homer, who since his death has been regarded as one of the giants of American art. Now, was this a matter of Evans getting lucky with one or two painters? I don't think so. In Homer's case, Homer has had the remarkable ability to appeal to each succeeding generation. Each generation has seen him differently. And Evans saw him as consistent with the mournful, elegiac quality of the artists he admired. He saw him as fitting in perfectly with those artists. We admired completely different qualities in Homer: his rich brushwork, his bold reality, the way he paints African Americans, the flashing quality of his watercolors. We see very, very different qualities. Homer remains a top American artist. Evans was indefatigable. He sold. We know him primarily since the collection, much of it was dispersed. We know him primarily through auction sales of his works. And let's not have Stieglitz on there for a second. In 1890, 1900, and 1913, big major auction sales of Evans' collection. His case shows us how hard it is to distinguish at times between the collector and the dealer. It is often said that dealers are only collectors who cannot afford to keep the objects for very long. In our own time, Dick Manoogian is probably the greatest collector of American art of the 1980s and 90s, and he's by far the greatest seller of American art of the 21st century. So people go through different evolutions. Styles and taste change slowly. The date of the last Evans sale, 1913, was also the date of the Armory show in New York, which marked the greatest cultural revolution since the Renaissance. Now modernism comes in. Traditional style no longer seems suitable for the modern age of the X-ray, the motion picture, the automobile, and the airplane, of psychoanalysis, Freud, the First World War, the destruction of the old social order. Alfred Stieglitz was the key figure for the development of modernism in the U.S. He was, to my eye, as multi-talented a figure as Charles Willson Peale, and he might well be considered the Peale of the 20th century. With the exception that instead of having children, naming them for famous artists, he influenced 3 generations of important collectors, dealers, and artists. Stieglitz himself was one of our greatest photographers. Among other things, he established for all time that photography is indeed art. Here are 3 photographs by Stieglitz of his second wife, Georgia O'Keeffe, and one of his views of New York. Stieglitz was also an art dealer, a high-minded, idealistic one, and one who played the role of critic, collector, theorist, and salesman of modernism. Through his famous gallery, 291, between 1908 and 1911, he introduced America and Americans to Matisse, Cézanne, Brancusi, African art, and to Picasso and Cubism, the revolutionary movement that forms the basis of all modern art up to today. Essentially we spent a century working out the ramifications and the implications of Cubism as developed by Picasso and Braque. It's still going on. He thus set the stage. There's the famous Picasso drawing that Stieglitz owned, bought at the Armory Show, gave to the Metropolitan Museum early on. Stieglitz also recognized and exhibited the work of several of the best young American modernists, including John Marin, Marsden Hartley, Arthur Dove, and Georgia O'Keeffe, whom you see here. And he established the canon of early American modernism that is still recognized today. With Stieglitz and his gallery, America for the first time had an avant-garde. Was Sargent the greatest painter in the world, as many continued to believe, or was Picasso? The choice was not simply a matter of preferring one style or another, but of choosing one worldview or another. Stieglitz and modernism moved one convert at a time until today, when his painters and their friends and allies, including Charles Sheeler and Stuart Davis and so on, are seen as the major American painters of the day. So Stieglitz, in the end, couldn't have succeeded if he hadn't been able to persuade his audience that his art was quintessentially American, a quality he emphasized over and over again. He called his group of artists Seven Americans. During the years of the First World War, Stieglitz faced a doubting conservative America, seemingly with two strikes against him. His Seven Americans included two gays and a woman. The styles they practiced were inspired by foreign masters in far-off Paris, and he himself was German, the land of our great enemy during the war. Moreover, he and his artists faced powerful rivals, including the regionalism of Thomas Hart Benton and Grant Wood, a style rooted in the rural Midwest, one that could claim to be truly American. The regionalist champion, Thomas Craven, derided Stieglitz as a Hoboken Jew without knowledge of or interest in the historical American background, while criticizing his artists as, quote, not being noticeably American in flavor. Stieglitz won out in the end because of his powers of persuasion, and more important probably because modernism presented a style perfectly suited to the anxieties, complexities, and ambitions of the modern age. Stieglitz influenced many people, but none more important than Mrs. John D. Rockefeller Jr., Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. During the 1920s, she took up two causes that she saw as interrelated: the preservation of the American past, including its buildings and artifacts, and the introduction of modern art to a still doubting country. With her husband's blessing, she took up the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, which you see here on the left, and the creation of the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller collection of American folk art. I love the folk art here, by the way. In the same years, without her husband's blessing, her husband looked at her abstract art and thought it was junk. She went ahead anyway, as strong women are wont to do, and she became one of, you may not realize, but the Museum of Modern Art was founded by three women over lunch one day in New York in 1929. Neither Williamsburg nor the modern could have happened without her. Her five sons, as is well known, carried on her legacy, making MoMA one of the greatest institutions in this nation, one that has affected American taste more powerfully, I would guess, than any other institution. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller was a real collector. She left 1,600 modern prints to MoMA, along with some of the paintings you see here, paintings by Matisse, Picasso, Charles Sheeler, and others, and she gave this Peaceable Kingdom by Edward Hicks to colonial Williamsburg. Key for her was the relationship between abstract art of Picasso and Matisse and the work of America's naive or folk painters. She found beauty in these early works by the Americans, and she saw them following Stieglitz's lead, who had similar shows and who had exhibitions of children's art, for example. Following Stieglitz, she saw them as providing roots for modernism, as validating the recent styles. Hard to imagine a more different character from Abby to Peggy Guggenheim, the most important collector at mid-century, another woman, but one of a very different type than Mrs. Rockefeller. This is the peripatetic Peggy, who in 5 short years in New York, from 1942 to 47, played a key role, really the key role, in the rise of abstract expressionism. It is important to remember that up to this point, all American art was derivative of European style. All American artists set out to learn what they could from European art and to transform it into something that would work in this country. But the great masters were still, we had never had in this country a Manet, a Cézanne, or a Picasso. Things changed overnight. On the eve of World War II, most of the most talented French painters, including the major surrealists, all came to New York because of the war, where they quickly encountered and came to know a group of ambitious young American painters, all of whom had been deeply influenced by Picasso and who aimed to seize artistic leadership of the world. Peggy herself left Paris for New York in the summer of 1941, bringing with her her latest husband, the surrealist painter Max Ernst, her children, and an extraordinary collection of the founders of modernism, not an American among them. She had superb works by Picasso, Kandinsky, Brancusi, Miro, and Mondrian, as you see here, as well as by Max Ernst and the other surrealists, including Yves Tanguy, which is the painting on the lower right. The other three are by Ernst. She decided to open in New York a combination museum and commercial gallery, very much in the spirit of Stieglitz, and she called it Art of This Century. Her gallery was flamboyantly, as hardly expresses it, designed by the Viennese architect Friedrich Kiesler. These are two interior views of the gallery. One gallery contained a museum exhibition on Cubism from her own collection. The second, a group of examples of European surrealism, while the third held changing exhibitions where works of art were for sale. She opened with a show of her own collection, but within months, her turn to exhibiting young American artists. In April 1943, her collage exhibition included works by Jackson Pollock, Robert Motherwell, and William Basiotes, marking the first time that the future abstract expressionists were exhibited. Advised by the best artistic minds in New York, it's almost impossible to put yourself back even this distance into the 1940s and imagine Peggy being advised by the most brilliant people in the art world, which included both Mondrian and Duchamp and the great curator James Johnson Sweeney, later director of the Guggenheim. With their help, she decided to give Jackson Pollock his first one-man show in late 1943. This small, sparsely attended event became the most important exhibition in the U.S. since the Armory Show of 1913. Critics and museums responded, and the Museum of Modern Art purchased Pollock's She-Wolf painting you see on the left screen. She soon gave Basiotes, Motherwell, Hoffman, Rothko, and Clifford Still one-man shows, but Pollock was her favorite, her greatest discovery. Within a few years, it had become clear that abstract expressionism had supplanted surrealism, that New York had replaced Paris, and that Pollock and a handful of his contemporaries were the outstanding painters in the world. The era of provincialism was over. Peggy's extraordinary collection is intact today. Susan and I were lucky enough to see it again 2 or 3 weeks ago in its palazzo in Venice, where it resides. She moved there in 1948, had this brilliant 5-year career in New York, took off, and nothing has been the same since. Peggy, more than anyone else, except of course the painters themselves, was responsible for the New York School and the rise of America to world leadership in the arts. It's an amazing turnaround and really a fantastic development. Not by coincidence. Oh, this is Pollock on the left, Harvard's Pollock on the left, and great de Kooning on the right. Not by coincidence at all. During exactly the same years, another outsider, Maxim Karolik of Boston, was reinventing American 19th century painting. Maxim Karolik was an immigrant tenor from Russia who married a wealthy, much older Boston lady, Martha Amory Codman. Always a good combination. One has money and one has taste. With his adventurous eye and taste and her money, they built the famous Karolik collection between 1941 and 1945, exactly the same years that Peggy was active in New York. And then they gave the entire collection to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston in 1948. And that collection has been, the fact of that collection being in Boston has been had a great effect on me and my studies, on John Wilberding, Barbara Novak, our whole generation of scholars of American art. Karolik was very specific in his philosophy, which was one all aspiring collectors, all collectors, could usefully follow. You'd be amazed how few do follow it. He said, "We discarded the motto of the fashionable connoisseur, quote, 'Tell me who the painter is, and I will tell you whether the painting is good,' unquote." Karolik said, "Our motto was, 'Tell me whether the painting is good, and I will not care who the painter is.'" That's the only useful way, it turns out, to collect art. Be moved by the painting, love it, worry later about who did it. Karolik had extraordinary results, ones that still affect our taste today. His favorite painters were mostly ones that William Corcoran would have known and approved, the masters of the Hudson River School, but instead of buying the big paintings of grand scenery, he bought small, plein-air, light-filled oil studies instead by Bierstadt, Kensett, and the others. And in the process, he discovered two masters whose work was entirely unknown to earlier collectors. They were Fitzhenry Lane, you see two of his paintings here, and Martin Johnson Heade here. Lane is now recognized as our leading marine painter, while Heade seems ever more admired for his brooding seascapes, his studies of light and atmosphere, and his highly original tropical compositions. You have a beautiful orchid composition here at the High. Together, the two painters are sometimes called luminists, and Karolik's love of small, serene, and mysterious works continues to influence today's taste. During the 1970s and 80s, the cycles of taste continued to spin slowly but regularly. In these decades, the taste of Thomas B. Clark and William T. Evans was revised in part. The tonalists, whom I mentioned, continued to be given short shrift, but the so-called American Impressionists, including William Merritt Chase, Childe Hassam, and Theodore Robinson, whom you see here on the screen, were avidly collectors by some outstanding collectors, the Horowitzes, the Frauds, and Daniel Terra. A few of the painters of idealized women in dreamlike states were revived, including Thomas W. Dewing, whom you see here on the left, and Frank W. Benson. But most of the others, like Will Lowe, whom you see on the right, and George Fuller, were never rediscovered and await discovery. Most surprising, what I show you here is Sargent on the left, Thomas Eakins on the right. Most surprising in this period, 1970s, was the rise of John Singer Sargent's reputation. He was, after all, an expatriate who spent his career largely in Paris, then London. He was a highly popular portrait painter among wealthy English and Americans during the late 19th century. But on his death in 1926, his reputation collapsed completely. From 1926 through the 60s, the 1960s, his works were considered the height of superficiality when I was in school, and not even American. Then suddenly, during the 1970s, a few collectors started buying Sargent's, and his paintings were soon heralded as the finest examples of American Impressionism. I still don't know how that happened. Among other things, is supply and demand. All of the Eakinses were in museums, and there were plenty of Sargent's available. Collectors need things to, this is one of the reasons taste changes constantly. Dealers need things to sell, collectors need things to buy. Sargent's, no question, a great painter, but the ebb and flow of his reputation and the way he's been embraced so much as an American painter is quite interesting. I compare this great Sargent on the left with Thomas Eakins' portrait of Maud Cook on the right. Eakins used to be thought to be the most profound American realist, but his reputation now has been completely eclipsed by Sargent with his bravura technique. Now for two tough cases. The two most out-of-fashion painters in the world are Karl Gutherdts, both German-born, and active most of their careers in America. Karl Gutherdts on the left, who lived in Memphis all his life, and Johann Ortel on the right. Just before coming down here on Tuesday, I received a catalog of Gutherdt's works produced by the Dixon in Memphis. Exactly, I can just imagine the excitement, exactly the kind of thing the museum should be doing. Gutherdt's was a local Memphis painter, highly popular in his day, and a couple of enterprising curators have put together great catalogs, so now we know who he was and what he did. Whether the world will respond or not, we don't know. But now at least we have the facts. My own personal problem is what to do about Ortel on the right. He was the favorite painter of Mr. and Mrs. Fogg, the founder of my museum, the Fogg Museum. The Foggs gave us a great Sanford Gifford, which we hang, a great Bierstadt of the Rockies, which we hang, and a group of Ortels, which are mostly rolled up and have never been seen. I've started, as you can see here, the cracks from rolling. They were rolled up years ago. I've started now unrolling and conserving them. And when the Harvard Art Museum reopens in 3 or 4 years, come and see whether I've had the courage to hang a group of Ortel's works. I'm not sure yet, but I know they need to be honored, and I'm constantly aware of how little we know about the art of the past, how selective our eye is, how we'll go into a collection, pick 1 or 2 things we happen to like, but ignore the rest of the paintings as if they didn't exist. And I find it much more interesting to try to embrace the whole period, the whole collector. Another interesting problem is that of Andy and Jamie Wyeth. I know Andy, getting tongue-tied here. I know Jamie well. I knew Andy very well. A marvelous, marveless man, a great painter. On the other hand, I don't believe any respecting modern-day art historian, at least no curator of 20th century art, would admit to liking the Wyeth's work. And yet, the people like it, and it's obviously beautifully executed and full of feeling. Now, this is a little bit like the Picasso and Sargent question. I mean, is Jasper Johns the greatest living painter, Jasper Johns or Cy Twombly, or is the just recently deceased Andrew Wyeth? And what will the situation be in 50 or 100 years? I know this museum had a very successful Wyeth show. One of my teachers, Agnes Mongan, had a wonderful Wyeth drawings exhibition at Harvard many years ago. This is, in terms of scholarship and taste, this is really an interesting question, and I hope we'll return in about 50 years and be able to discuss this question and see what's happened to the relative reputations of these artists. And you'll notice in the Sotheby's and Christie's catalogs, Andy Wyeth's work and Jamie's are both sold along with the 19th century painters. They're not ever seen in the contemporary art sales. They're considered sui generis. There's nothing else like them. There's no one else really painting like them with any success. Realists today, very appealing ones, very good ones, and what are we to make of that as cultural historians? In conclusion, let me say a few words about Alice Walton, the greatest collector of our time. Alice comes from Mineral Wells, Texas, and Bentonville, Arkansas. She's seen here with my friend and her advisor, Professor John Wilmerding, recently retired from Princeton University. She's the daughter of Sam Walton and is thought to be the wealthiest woman in the world. due to the success of the Walmart stores. She is also a highly accomplished businesswoman and philanthropist. She is now building the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville. For the last 6 or 7 years, she has, with very good scholarly advice, been buying what she and John consider to be the masterpieces of American art, at least the ones that can be still pried loose. And it's amazing the effect on money has on making things available. Though New York and Philadelphia consider her to be a tasteless raider in the same way that Europe regarded Frick and Mellon when they were buying up Raphael's and Rembrandt's early in the century, I am inclined to view Alice Walton's collecting as part of a continuing historical process. Art follows the money, and she has the money. Among other things, she is also righting a considerable historic wrong. That is the relative lack of major collections, public collections of American art in the South. That's been a long-established fact. Many fine museums here in this area, but her collection will be a landmark move. Now that the Northwest has significant art in Seattle, San Francisco was well taken care of, Texas was fairly late in this, but during the 70s and 80s, Dallas and Houston, Fort Worth all collected great things. The South, where we are, the last area that is still relatively short of our heritage. The museums of New England, where I come from, have much too much art. And they don't appreciate it. Many of the cities have great collections in the basement, and there needs to be, I'm not sure that it involves buying, but there are many museums like Portland and Springfield and so on, don't have the money to support themselves, have great collections, and there should be a way to ship some of what you may have, which is some money, and get some of what they have, which is some art, even if it's not on an ownership basis. There has to be some way to balance this out so that the public across the country can really see our artistic heritage. Alice has bought a number of textbook masterpieces, including Charles Willson Peale's, back to Charles Willson Peale, Charles Willson Peale's George Washington at Princeton on the left, and Asher B. Durand's quintessential Hudson River School painting, Kindred Spirits, long owned by the New York Public Library, long on view at the Metropolitan Museum. This caused a cry of anguish all up and down Fifth Avenue when she took it off and brought it south. She also purchased from Richard Manoogian Heath's famous set of 16 hummingbird studies, The Gems of Brazil on the left, as well as Richard Caton Woodville's iconic picture, Mexican War News on the right, which Manoogian himself bought not long ago from a hard-up museum, the National Academy of Design in New York. She also purchased Frederick E. Church's Home by the Lake of 1852, which was sold by the Walker Art Center in 1989. Let's get that right. Frederick E. Church's Home by the Lake of 1852, which was sold by the Walker Art Center in 1989. Luckily, time forbids that I explain that this is the most heartbreaking picture of my career. But Stephanie, remind me later to tell you about me, Alexander Acevedo, and this painting at the Sotheby's auction. In 20th century, she has bought very similarly, concentrating on established masterworks by artists such as Marsden Hartley and Stuart Davis. Overall, I can't wait to be asked to review the show when it opens. The museum is being designed by a great American architect who lives in Cambridge, Moshe Safdie, and I can't wait to see it when it opens, and I hope someone asks me to review it. I sort of hope they don't, too. The taste, as far as I've seen so far, is very, very conservative. None of the cutting edge, none of the revival paintings. There's no Nothing strange, very few expatriates, few women. I don't know of a work by an African American painter in the collection. It's a very, very 1965, 1970 collection, which is exactly the time, of course, that Wilmerding and I were studying and learning this field. So that may change before it opens. It'll be very, very interesting. Before her arrival on the scene, I would have guaranteed that it would be impossible to form a major collection of American art today, but I would have been totally wrong. Only history really will be able to judge how well she did, but no one will ever again be able to say that American art is either underappreciated or either underappreciated or underpriced. Thanks very, very much.
Thank you, Dr. Stebbins. That was wonderful. He's agreed to answer a couple of questions, and then we want to get everyone over into the Stent family wing for a brief reception. So are there any questions from the audience at this point? No? Okay, then let's have a cocktail. Okay, no, a question has arisen.
My question is about an artist who I like, it's very difficult to find anything about her. And one of her paintings, her name is Bertha Lacey, and one of her paintings sold for $300 and another one sold for $40,000. And they look very similar to me. And I'm wondering, how can that be?
It can easily be. I showed you an example of a miniature where one work sold for $10,000, one work for $1 million too. The art market is a strange and mysterious place. I don't know this painter, but if you see one for $300, buy it if you like it. Anybody else?
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Stebbins.
Thank you. Thanks.